Okay, and the next step, what I'm going to do for video purposes, is I'm not going to install the base plate or the landing gear so I can get the heli under the camera easier. Also, I'm going to come back and we'll do the fuel tank because there's some stuff I want to talk about there, like the clunk line. So we'll come back to these steps later. But what we will do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to go ahead and to stiffen up the frame a little in the front, I'm going to go ahead and mount the radio holder box. Radio equipment holder box. So let's go ahead and mount that, get the self tappers out of bag B4B, and let's go ahead and get that installed, and then we're going to come back and we're going to do the clutch assembly and mount it on the engine. Okay, next step is the screws were placed into the fan, but were not tightened, and we need to Loctite them. Also, I've seen a lot of folks online talk about the fan being warped. And that's possible. I checked mine, I put this on a high point balancer and spun it, and it didn't look warped to me for mine. So, but one thing that may be happening is maybe some folks, just an idea, are tightening down these screws and not in a regular pattern. In other words, they're tightening down one and then tightening down another. What you want to do is put these in and tighten them up in a pattern, a little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit, and then reverse it, little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit, you know, that kind of thing till you get it tightened up. Otherwise, you may cause this to warp in tightening. Additionally, you may find if you put the fan on the hub one way and let's say it oscillates, try taking the screws out and rotating it to another set of holes, and you might be able to find an optimum place where the wobble is not as bad. Again, my hub and fan checked out, so either I got lucky or some folks are getting warped fans for some reason, don't know. Okay, so let's go ahead and get Loctite on these screws and get this tightened up and get ready for the next step. By the way, something I noticed that I hadn't noticed till I started to screw it together is, and this may be one reason why some people are having trouble, is you'll notice there's a large hole and a small hole. So there's two large holes opposing and two small holes opposing. Also, the screws are different sizes. You probably figured that out when you put it together. What you don't want to do is get the wrong holes in the wrong screw and force them in. So you need to get the large piece of the hub, which takes the bigger diameter screw, and line that up with the big hole on the fan. So previously when I said if you're getting a wobble, you can't rotate it 90 to fix it. You have to rotate it 180 because of the way these holes are, okay? So I just noticed that myself trying to put it together, and what you don't want to do is try and force the large screw in the small hole. Otherwise that may cause some problems with the fan. So just note that there are two different size holes on this fan, and they must line up to the proper holes for the screw size, okay? Smaller, larger. Alright? So go ahead and get it together, and then we'll come back and continue. Okay, in the next step, I am going to be using a governor on my heli. I'm going to show a GV1 first, and then I'll show the Curtis ATG later. But I'm going to show the GV1 setup, flying, that kind of thing, and then later I'll do the ATG. Anyway, with most governors come two magnets. The reason that is you put one in each hole for balancing of the fan, okay? But it's important that the magnets be oriented so one has a pole, let's say north pole sticking up, and the other one has south pole sticking up, because the sensor reads one side of the magnet, not the other. Okay, now I have two magnets here. Okay, so the sensor, if you put both north up or both south up, your governor's not going to work. You need one one way, one the other. So how do you tell without, you know, getting your governor all set up so you can read the sensor and everything? Well, when two magnets stick together, opposite poles attract. So a north pole and a south pole will attract each other, okay? If you flip one of the magnets over so it's, you know, say north north or south south, we really don't know at this point, they will try to push away from each other. So take the magnets stuck together, and then you know that one end is going to be a north market and the other end is going to be a south market, okay? That way we know which way these magnets are going to go in. So we want one end with a south and one end with a north. So now what we're going to do is we're going to mix up some epoxy. We're going to put the magnets in the holes. Don't use CA, okay? CA is not reliable enough. You're going to mix up some epoxy, get some in the holes, push the magnets in, wipe off the excess, and be done. I'm going to put it so my ink marks are facing up, okay? And that way I know I've got one north and one south pole. Doesn't matter which, we just need one opposite than the other. That's the best way to tell. So let's go ahead and get those glued in, and we'll come back and continue. Okay, so we've got our magnets in. Now what I like to do is just keep a thin film of epoxy over the magnet and the fan just to make sure it doesn't pop out. Okay, it's kind of like just consider it a cover, but thin. Don't make it a blob because that sensor has to get as close as possible. Additionally, so you know, for the GV1, these magnets sat flush with the fan. Okay, so make sure you've got them pressed all the way in. I used a very small modeling C-clamp to press them in, squeeze the epoxy out, and get them flush. Okay, and again, make sure. Basically, I put my ink marks down when I put them in. It was just easier that way. So. Now the next thing is, this is called a high point balancer. I don't even know if you can get them anymore. I believe you can, but I like to check the balance of my fan because remember, this thing's going to be turning at high RPM. So basically you put it on the high point. Now it needs to be a fairly sensitive balancer so that you can actually tell, but as you can see here, I have a little bit of a heavy spot. See the fan come back? Okay, so if I rotate it lightly, okay, and you'll see it drops on one side. So not much though. So this is the heavy side here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take, you can take some sandpaper and sand a little bit of the plastic. Another way maybe to take a drill bit and not drill through the fan, but just drill some lightning dimples, if you will. Be careful not to drill through. Drilling through will damage the fan and leak air. So the bottom line is I need to balance that. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. It's an optional step. You don't have to do it if you don't have the tools to do it, but I recommend finding someone who has a balancer that you can check it with and at least get your fan as balanced as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and get my fan balanced and we'll continue. Okay, pretty straightforward. 3 little dimples here, and I wound up taking too much, so I had to put one dimple here. But basically, as you can see now, the fan stays put no matter where I put it, so it's nice and balanced, okay? To do it, I just used a little barrel sander and just made little dimples, and it worked out great. So now my fan's nice and balanced. Alright, so I recommend doing that. Okay, the next thing is just to show you that the fan's done. Now we're going to get it on the motor. Okay, before we do anything to mount the fan, we got some stuff to do. Now pulling this out of the box was pretty darn oily, which makes sense. But in order for the Loctite to work on here, we need to clean this up with alcohol, clean the threads in the nut up with alcohol. Alright, and also we need to remove the carburetor to get it in and out. Now there's 2 things to be careful of. One, there's a spacer washer that goes between the carb and the hole in the engine. Don't lose it. Additionally, don't lose this rubber O-ring, okay? So go ahead and set that aside. Alright, so let's get this cleaned up with alcohol and we'll come and we'll put the fan on. Okay, next step is go ahead and loosen up these Allen screws on the hub here. Now this hub secures in 2 ways. One is a nut goes on here and tightens it down, and then there's these 2 set screws here that close this onto the crankshaft. Okay, I'm going to show you the order in which I prefer to do this and the reason why. This bearing, this is a thrust washer, okay? This bearing, the inner race of this bearing needs to be secured onto this crank. On the back side of the crank, on this end of the bearing, there's a shoulder on the crank. This washer, when put on this side and you tighten down the hub, it should push this washer onto the inner race of the front bearing. That makes sure that the inner race of the bearing is properly captured and is turning with the crank, not the crank turning in the bearing. Get your thrust bearing on there, and then go ahead and put your fan on. Okay, now what we need to do next is put the nut on. So I'm going to use some blue Loctite. Okay, and we had everything cleaned up. Now also note the nut has a very flat side and a very rounded side. Okay, the flat side goes toward the hub. Again, notice the machining. There's rounded corners on one side and not on the other. Okay, now, so we go ahead and put that on. Now, what we want to do is we want to tighten up this nut first so that we make sure that hub is pushed down onto all the way on the crankshaft, so that thrust bearing is pushed against the inner race of the bearing. Now, one thing you may notice is when you're tightening this up is the crankshaft may turn. Okay, if it does, go get yourself one of the engine locks where you have to remove the back cover and it secures the rod, or you can rotate the engine until you can see down the intake port and stick a plastic handled toothbrush in there. Do not stick anything in to lock the piston or anything here to lock the piston, because you risk bending the crankshaft or damaging the piston. Okay, so do not do that. Anyway, needless to say, I've always done it this way and it works. Grab a rag around the fan, That gives you, so it doesn't cut you, and that gives you a little more leverage. And then go ahead and tighten up that nut. Pardon me there. I like to make sure it's real tight. Okay. Once on, we're done there. Okay, I held it with a rag and tightened it up with a wrench. Okay, now we can go ahead and take out these two Allen screws, Loctite them, and tighten them up, and we basically got our fan on. Alright, so that's going to conclude this step, and we'll move on with the rest of the build. One more real quick thing, excuse me, is when you tighten up these screws on the hub, don't tighten one and then the other. Do them evenly, little, 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 little. Otherwise you risk pinching one side or the other, okay? So I just wanted to stress that. Anyway, we're done with this step. You can go ahead and temporarily put the carburetor back on your engine until we get ready to go on. Okay, last but not least, mount the clutch, and basically it goes on like so. Notice there's an open area and a flat area. It can only really go on one way. Get that lined up. Now, clean out the threads here with alcohol. Clean the screws with alcohol. By the way, out of the screw bag, you want to get the two that already have lock washers on them, okay? As you see, the lock washers are already on the screws. Loctite this down, get it lined up. No big deal. There may be a little lateral play in the screw, but just get them locked up, and then tighten these up evenly. Again, don't tighten one all up and then the other. So little to tight, okay? And that's going to finish the clutch fan assembly, and we're going to go on with the next step, which is fan shroud and mounting it in the engine.